We've always been taught in our lives that we should think before making a decision, and that the bigger that decision is, the more time we should spend thinking about it. This gives us quite a simple model of decision making, as the decisions become tougher and more impactful on our lives. So should the amount of time we spend thinking about those decisions. And in theory, this should lead us to make much better choices in life. Now, this all sounds fine and reasonable, except that a lot of studies have shown that the exact opposite of this might be true, that the more time we spend thinking about tough decisions, the worse decisions we end up making. So let's dig into a few of these studies. Professor Dijksterhuis at the University of Amsterdam had always wanted to know what the best way of making a decision was, so he decided to conduct an experiment and find out. The experiment was quite simple. People had to choose between four different cars and got four pieces of information about each car. For example, car A had good economy but a bad transmission, whilst car B had bad handling but plenty of legroom. The experiment was designed so that there was one car that was objectively better than all of the others. There was a clear winner. And Dijksterhuis wanted to see whether people could select the right one. After showing everyone all of this information, he then gave one group of participants time to think about which car they now wanted to select. And after they'd spent time thinking about it, he then asked them to choose one of the cars. The other group of participants saw all of the same information, but they weren't given any time to think because the experimenter distracted them with some word puzzles, and then all of a sudden stopped them and asked them what car they wanted to select. The result was that the group of people who were given time to think chose the right car much more often. So far, this goes along with conventional wisdom. Spend time thinking and you'll make better choices in life. But Dijksterhuis was only just getting started. You see, in real life, decisions are rarely ever this simple. If you've ever bought a car or even a phone, you'll know that you get much more than four pieces of information. So he decided to make the experiment more realistic. He repeated the experiment, but this time giving people 16 pieces of information instead of 4 pieces of information about each car. Now there were details on things like the amount of boot space, the number of cup holders, and so on. And he separated the groups as before. The results were quite shocking. The group that had time to think picked the right car less than 25% of the time. They performed worse than random chance because if you randomly choose from four cars, you should get the right answer 25% of the time. Incredibly, the group that didn't get time to think got the right answer more than 60% of the time. And this wasn't a one-off occurrence. He did similar studies with a lot of other products, such as sofas, and the results never changed. When people were asked to make tough decisions, where a lot of variables and information were involved, they always tended to perform worse when they spent time thinking about it. But the question then arises, why? Surely you should make better decisions if you spend time thinking about them. The answer lies, as with a lot of things, in our brain. Specifically a section of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. This is a very special area of our brain. You see, no other animal has a prefrontal cortex as large as humans do. And it does some pretty amazing things. The prefrontal cortex is the rational area of our brain. It's why we can control ourselves when we're angry. It's why we can be good at maths. And it's what allows us to engage in deep thought. You could argue in many ways it's what separates humans from other animals. While being amazing, this area of the brain has one fundamental flaw. It can only manage a few variables at a time. This is why when participants in Dijksterhuis' study were only given 4 pieces of information about each car, the group who had more time to think and engage their prefrontal cortex made much better decisions. But when those same people were given 16 pieces of information about each car, their prefrontal cortex was all of a sudden overloaded, and so the more time they spent thinking, the more confused they became. But then another question also comes to mind. What about the other group of participants? Why did they perform so well when they were given more information? The answer to that question lies in our unconscious brain. See, unlike our prefrontal cortex, which is limited in how much information it can deal with, our unconscious brain, that's the areas of our brain that we're not aware of, have unlimited processing power, and so they have no issue dealing with a lot of information. So when the people in Dijkstra House's study were distracted with the word puzzles, their unconscious brain was actually processing all of the information that they'd just seen, and so they ultimately made better decisions. Now, you're probably wondering, what does this really mean in real life? Should we just act on instinct? Should we buy a house because of a feeling? The answer is quite simple. You should use the part of your brain that's best suited for the decision at hand. If you're buying a house, for example, you'll first need to figure out what your budget is and how much you can actually afford. This is very much a prefrontal cortex activity. It's great at doing these kind of calculations. Next, when you come to actually choosing a house, there are simply too many variables to consider, from the build quality of the house to the amount of space you have, all the way to the crime rate in the local neighborhood. So you are then left with two options. The first option is to reduce the number of variables. If you can bring the variables down to the 4 or 5 things that actually matter to you about a house, you can then engage your prefrontal cortex and do a proper analysis and comparison between the different houses you have available. If you can't reduce the number of variables, or you don't know what's most important to you, then this is a task for your unconscious brain. View all of the houses and look at all of the information that's available. Then you simply have to give your unconscious brain time to process all of the things that you've just seen. Go for a walk, go out with a friend, do anything that will simply distract you for a few hours. And when you get back, simply trust your feelings and your instincts. It's the decision that your unconscious brain has made for you. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment and subscribe. And if you enjoyed this video, check out my other ones too.